And the first thing you do as a pastor is, hey, why don't you come to our Easter service? Well, the response was, I'm Jewish. And I said to myself, well, Jesus was Jewish too, but that wasn't the remark that I said. But what I noticed was people don't necessarily respond to an invite. They will respond to a relationship.
Hey there, welcome to the Intentional Churches podcast, where we really strive to give you practical wisdom and insights for leading your church today and really aligning back to personal ownership of the Great Commission. Aaron's out this week, but I am joined by a good friend. We have become better and better friends over the last few weeks and months. Duane Roberts. Duane, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on, Doug. I really appreciate the opportunity.
It's good, man. Well, we always start with just a real quick, who are you, kind of to give us your bio. But I want you to sit a little more because your salvation story really touched me. And I'd like for our listeners to hear just how you came to Christ and give us an overview of you professionally, if you would, quickly, and family. So,
yeah, sure. I came out of a Catholic background and I ended up moving to Florida in 1990. And I really didn't have a direction. I rebelled hard. I loved New York City. I loved the fast life. And it was a real hard transition to move to the state of Florida. And so I rebelled for several years. And then I have a mother who's really passionate about education. She said, you better do something with your life. And so I started to go to college. And in college, I met my beautiful wife. We're married 26 years this November. That first year of learning just how to be a husband, I was really lost. And someone invited me to church, Calvary Chapel, in 1999 to a Wednesday night service. And I gave my heart to Jesus that night. And then afterwards, it was just really God moving in our marriage. We both came to know Christ together at Calvary Chapel. We have 3 kids. So throughout that journey, we've had 3 children of our own, 2 boys and a girl. And to be honest, I never thought I would be actually pastoring at a church in which I found Jesus. But much later on, after spending about 20 years in the engineering field in the corporate world, I was asked to come on staff in 2014. And since 2014, I've been a full-time pastor, now serving as a campus pastor at one of our locations, as well as an executive pastor leading our campus initiatives. So that's me in a nutshell.
And that's great, Duane. And so for our listeners, this season, we've really been trying to dig into this idea of, we're calling it radical alignment to personal ownership of the Great Commission. And in leading churches, I led for a number of years here in Las Vegas that grew to a fairly good size, but the complexity of what it had become, really, now that I reflect back, it was pretty substantial. And I do have some regrets about, we really did convert to what I call this institutional mindset, that as if the brand and our programming or ideas are what won and grew people in Jesus' name. And so I think for our listeners, can you just give as much context as you're willing about Calvary Chapel, complexity there, just kind of give them the lay of the land before we jump into this conversation around radical alignment.
Yeah, so Calvary Chapel started, the one in Fort Lauderdale started in 1985. If you know Calvary Chapel, the history, the late 1960s, during the Woodstock age, a man by the name of Chuck Smith started a Calvary Chapel movement. If you've ever seen the movie Jesus Revolution, it's about the start of Calvary. And so there's always been this idea of inviting all kinds of people to come to know Jesus. That movement led to a pastor who planted a church in Calvary Chapel, Fort Lauderdale in 1985. And in about 2006, we were very successful. Initially, they started in a funeral home. So just imagine that. There was a funeral home planned.
That's awesome.
And so we joke about people getting resurrected and actually coming to service that, maybe we're there for memorial reasons. But anyway, about 2006, Calvary Chapel grew very fast. And in about 2006, the multi-site movement started to come about, and many churches were sort of fledgling, failing for many reasons, leaders failing, money reasons. And we kind of fell into multi-site. So I would say our first 4 or 5 multi-sites were revitalization projects. Pastors and leaders were coming to us and saying, we really want to keep this in the kingdom. And we feel like Calvary Chapel could be the one that helps us sort of restart this for the kingdom. So we kind of fell into it. Right now, as we speak, we've launched our 10th campus in Calvary downtown, Fort Lauderdale. We have altogether, we planted 16 campuses. We have 3 that have gone independent. So at some point along the journey, they say, hey, I think we're being called to a different vision. And so we transitioned them off and they're running independently. And then we've had some ones that we would say failed. Then we had 3 that we had to close for different reasons. Either the plant didn't take off, the leader was not the right leader. And those are ones that we've closed. So currently we have 10. And I don't know if I told you, we have an online campus and we have a virtual reality campus as well. So that's a whole nother ballgame altogether.
VR campus.
A VR campus.
For another conversation, we will go down that road then. But okay, my blood pressure just went up because as a recovering executive pastor, I'm like, the complexity of leading that organization and really trying to keep it rooted in biblical fundamentals and not just a runaway organization, man. It's just like, oh, you okay?
Mm-hmm.
Like,
yes, I am. Having a lot of fun.
Good. The other complexity I wanted to discuss, just to give our listeners a little feel, because this is happening more and more throughout America, especially in urban areas. But there are still a lot of our listeners who are in areas that are more homogenous. South Florida is an absolute melting pot. So give us, number one, just some kind of like picture of the mosaic of South Florida of people. And then I'd love for you to talk about how, as leading a church, that creates additional complexities. So number one, just paint us a picture, but number two, tell it how it really affects the complexity of what you're trying to lead.
Yes, you're absolutely right. South Florida, we would say, when Jesus says in the Great Commission, therefore go to all nations and make disciples, we feel that God has brought all the nations to us. We really don't have to go anywhere because all the nations are very present. Huge Caribbean context, Asian, European, Latin American, Middle Eastern. We see them all, and our campuses are planted in all of those diverse populations today. So you may go to certain parts of the state, in South Florida, and you could drive 30 minutes south and you'll end up in a highly densely populated Asian area or a Caribbean area. And people tend to move and migrate together. But we have seen a beautiful diversity of not only nations, but also some of those campuses some are in affluent areas where you see more of the business population, and some are not so affluent areas where you see folks struggling to keep housing. It's not strange to have somebody that comes to our church that said, I was sleeping in my car for a couple of weeks, and they're trying to get themselves started. You have folks that are coming in that we provide Spanish translation. We have Spanish translation, we have a Creole translation, and we have Portuguese translation in several of our campuses. So again, just to give you a picture of what we do on a regular basis, that's kind of sums it up.
Yeah. So as you guys lead, then I don't know if you've ever stopped to think about it, how does that complicate, leading a church to have that in addition to the organizational complexities?
Yeah, I believe the challenge is, when you talk about misalignment, I was saying to myself, I don't think misalignment is out of a malicious intent. I don't think people wake up saying, hey, I want us to be misaligned and make everything very, very complex. But it is very challenging to remain true to your mission to make disciples, our core vision, which is to reach our community and change our world, when 10 different campuses might have different contexts altogether on how that is expressed. And so sometimes we're running interference with one another on our event calendar, and we don't intend to do it. but a pastor may have a heart for their context and says, this is how I feel we make disciples. But if you run that back up the channel, it may feel like it's competing with some of the other ways that we desire to make disciples. So we're trying to figure out ways to say, what is the marker of a disciple? What is someone that we would say it's being transformed in the way that Jesus transformed his disciples? And we're trying to figure out what those clear markers are across all of our campus expressions. So that's just some of the complexities.
How are you personally thinking about, this ownership of the Great Commission, that you are a disciple maker? And then we'll get into talking about how you're thinking about it as Calvary and leadership and all that. But what is God laying on your heart in this season personally about ownership of the Great Commission?
I was convicted probably a year or two ago. So part of our campus makeup is that we are a live teaching multi-site campus. So it's a hybrid model. So we teach locally as campus pastor about 80%, and we tune into some sort of global stream 20%, so that everyone knows our lead pastor is Pastor Doug Souter. But I was convicted driving home, pulling up to my garage, and all I did was open the door and walk inside after church service. So I left the institution and I kind of went into my cul-de-sac, and I did nothing about what I was actually preaching. So I'm preaching, go make disciples, but I wasn't practicing what I was preaching. And so I got deeply convicted, and and my wife and I began to make really intentional connections with our neighbors as they walked their dog, as we went out to get the mail, as we were doing the landscaping. We began to just really connect. There was a new family that lived next door to us. And the first thing you do as a pastor is, hey, why don't you come to our Easter service? Well, the response was, I'm Jewish. And I said to myself, well, Jesus was Jewish too, but that wasn't the remark that I said. But what I noticed was people don't necessarily respond to an invite. They will respond to a relationship. So I felt like it was like, get to know them first, get to be in relationship with them first. And so really the scripture that hits home for me is Acts 1:8. And the idea is that we'll be witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the other parts of the world. And I felt like the Lord was telling me, who's in your Jerusalem? You start there. And then you begin to go tell stories to your congregation. So my heart is, how do I start in my Jerusalem? Who is in my Jerusalem that I need to be paying attention to? And how does the Great Commission get practice? So that way I preach it with a little bit more confidence and experience just in preaching and not actually doing it.
Well, thanks, Duane, for being vulnerable and sharing, because I think that's a lot of our listeners are in that kind of mode. Like, my job is giving people church or producing church for people. And we found, at least, that a lot of us, so I look back at my own ministry, and a lot of times I wasn't actually living out the Great Commission. I wasn't being anti. I just was it was my professional job to be clergy. So I just appreciate the vulnerability. And so tell us what's the best story of, not best necessarily, but what's a story of late of this investment in neighbors? Like, have you had any good intersections over the last several months with a neighbor? Or
the same neighbor that moved into the home next door, when they got there, they were not married. So first thing you're thinking, oh, they're living together, and the Christian mind says they're cohabitating, they're doing this. And as we began to get to know them, we were there when they got married. They told us their date. Here, we're getting married this date. And I can't forget a moment when I said, we're going to pray for your marriage. And if you ever need marriage advice, my wife and I are here for you. And the fact that I stopped to say that I would pray, the woman, my neighbor, this young lady, just started crying in the middle of my cul-de-sac and said, I cannot believe you're actually going to pray for us. We were there for their first baby. They just had their baby. Same thing. As she was carrying, I said, I will pray for you. Cannot believe. Now, they haven't been to a service yet.
Right.
But the fact that we're investing in them relationally, they love it. And so their first birthday party, the son's birthday party, I go in there and they're acting like they're acting, and they're saying things they probably shouldn't be saying, and drinking things they probably shouldn't be drinking, right? So so then one of the then my neighbor says, "Hey, he's the pastor. He just said he's a pastor. Like, watch what you say." So I go, well, but the fact that we're actually building a relationship, they haven't necessarily been to any one of our churches, but we built a trust where they look at us as spiritual guides and people that are actually praying and investing in them spiritually, even though they don't even understand what that means. It's shocking to them. There's a special bond that we've just established through that.
Well, man, I didn't know you were going to say that or give that story, but you just hit between the eyes what we're trying to get churches to do at intentional churches, and that is we. It's not about inviting to the institution. We have to get back to the basic blocking and tackling of building relationships, not with a agenda other than anything to love on people, and then see what the Spirit and Jesus reveal for the right spiritual conversations along the way. So great job, man. That's awesome. Our listeners can't see, but tell us. So I'm going to ask you to describe. Tell us about the shirt you're wearing. What's on your T-shirt, man?
For the one, so this
Yeah,
is our.
love it. Go, man. So tell us more about it, because now I want to turn the conversation. We can talk about how that story about your neighbor is influencing you and your team at Calvary to think about how do we lead literally thousands of people to do what you're doing with your neighbor. So tell us about For the One first.
So for the one emerged out of well, in 2018, we realized as a church we really needed to establish some core values, mission statements, vision to get our church and our staff, our board, our leaders to be going in the same direction. And we felt in 2018 that the tagline was "Get in the story." Everyone has a story, and Jesus is still writing stories in our communities and our churches. And then it was a 5-year vision, and that 5-year vision ended in 2023. So we began to pray as a leadership team, and we just asked the question, God, where are you taking us next? And we basically said, stories happen one life at a time. Every story is a person, and that's a life. And then we just kind of narrowed it down to for the one. It's for the one. It's Matthew 18. It's Luke 15. And how do we mobilize people to go after their one? So that was last year. And it was crazy before we re-engaged one another, and I started seeing stuff about IC. I go, there seems to be some synergy around that. So we have merch for the one. We do vision for the one. One for the one is plastered almost everywhere on all of our campuses, so people know leaving, who's God called me to reach in my, Jerusalem? Who's my one?
Yeah, so let's dig into something you just said. By the way, of course, we love it, man. It's like right down the pipe of so many of our the churches that we're associated with intentional churches. So,
Mm-hmm.
but you said something in there that I think I really want to unpack for our listeners, and that was you said get on the same page, and you talked about typical things you would do, mission, vision, etc. But tell us some ways you went about getting on the same page as a leadership, because ultimately that is what we feel like with intentional churches in the next season we have to call the American church back to, is really getting clear on, we use the word radical alignment, but are we pulling the rope in the same direction? And that is a tall task to get, because everybody coming to your church, leaders included, have staff included, have a little bit of a different idea about what church should be. So tell us how you, first, let me ask, what did you see as a leadership that made you think, oh, we're not way misaligned, but we really need to get on the same page? And then secondarily, what were some of the practices that you guys did to get more on the same page?
Yes, I feel as we started to really pray and sit around, there is about 6 folks on our executive team. And we really started to think about, as a large organization, how do we make our church small and simplify? And that's one of the hardest things in the world to do. It's sometimes your vision could be so complex or your organization could be so complex. It is very difficult for people to get people rowing and pulling in the same direction. So we really prayed and asked God, how can we do this simply? And so as a leadership team, it probably took us 5 months to really go through everything that we do. Is this really aligning with where God is taking us? We started to look at let's sort of debrief the last 5 years. What were some of the wins? What were some of the things we didn't want to carry forward? Even though we're a large organization, we're highly organic. So a lot of our teams did not like the fact that we were calling disciples like the words metrics don't really translate well in a church world. So you start saying KPIs. I mean, I'm used to that, but in the church world, that doesn't make sense. So we began to boil it down to a couple of things. We said, hey, let's get back to simply making disciples. That is it. Like, what does that look like? What does Matthew 28 look like across every campus? What does it look like to mobilize people? So we don't want to just attract people to us. We want to send people out. And then the third one was we have hopes and dreams to continue to plant more campuses. So how can we build a culture of generosity? How can we get people that want to invest in the kingdom? And then we invited some of our best leaders and best representation from every campus. So we facilitated focus groups and we asked them to come pray with us. Does this look right? Does it make sense? Rather than us sort of leading the organization from a top-down approach where we were kind of pushing vision, we really were intentional about facilitating these co-created vision and innovation experiences because we were saying in 10, 20 years, we're not going to be the ones sitting at this table. We need to be raising up leaders that are going to be able to carry the vision forward. So we need their voices. And we brought some of our best millennials. We brought some of our best young leaders. And we started really praying together. And we boiled it down. We have three things that we focus on right now. One is, what's our discipleship pathway look like? How do we mobilize leaders? And how do we steward generosity and grow where God is taking us?
You're hitting on something that I think is a shift in generational leadership in the church. And that is approach about how we rally toward mission, vision, strategy. And there's all kinds of models out there, from congregational models where kind of everybody gets a vote to, the more, I don't know what to call it, but like almost the mom and dad model where, the family leads the church and whatever the vision is that God's given them, we all just salute and move in that direction. And I want to be respectful here, but there are a lot of models.
Sure. No,
you use
no
the
problem.
word, I love what you're describing. It's part of the ethos of what we try to practice at IC across the board. It's what we believe that church leaders should be bringing into things like their preaching even, and their whatever their membership classes are or growth track, whatever their engagement pathway in our language would be. And that is this word of co-creation. I heard very clearly you invited in kind of your core, a lot of your core and influencers and other things to co-create with you. Can you explain for our listeners who may not be as familiar with that, what did that look like? What did that mean? Just talk just a little bit about what those meetups look like and what they produced.
Yeah, well, I would say that you have to have a spirit of patience. You have to be willing to break down some of your old mental models, because sometimes you have people that are coming in with traditional ways to make disciples, and maybe you're in a space where millennials are more on their phones. So how do we do digital discipleship as well as in-person discipleship? How do we look at these hybrid models? But basically, we set up a meeting room, and we would come in, and one exercise that we would do is, hey, if you were to say that this person has gone through one of our discipleship tracks, what would be some of the markers we would need to see that's consistent across all of our campuses? But you're going to get somebody that's in a more affluent campus say, this is what that looks like. A businessman starting a Bible study group at his versus somebody that's teaching, hey, gone through a growth track, gone through one of our initial, we have a Following Jesus class. It's for new believers. And then we had sticky notes, and we put sticky notes on this whiteboard in this big conference room, and we would cycle through all of it. What does a missional leader look like? How do we know he's mobilized or she's mobilized? And then say you had 15 of those, and then we would say, let's rank them, because we can't do 15 if we're going to simplify. Let's boil them down maybe to the top 3 or 5. And we would force rank them. And then you would end up discarding 10. And everybody felt honored by that process. Everybody felt during the co-creation that their voices were heard, their campus was represented, their department was represented, who they were represented. And we did that also with our board of elders as well. We invited them to speak in, because they see things a little bit differently. And a lot of times they're sitting in our campuses saying, why are we not doing it this way? So that's a space for them to ask that question. And we had to figure that out together. Those were not easy meetings. If you don't like meetings, it's a lot of meetings to reduce meetings in the future. So that's what tons of meetings. I would not, like, a lot of people don't have the capacity to do. But I came from a corporate world. I love meetings. I love good meetings. I don't just love meetings for meeting's sake. I love productive meetings. So for those meetings, if we're going to be talking about where is God taking Calvary in the next 10, 20, 30 years of the church, we need to have those meetings. So that way we get clear direction on how we're going to go forward together.
Well said, Duane. Well said about meetings and like the capacity to do the meetings. So what I'm hearing is, okay, that was a year plus ago that you were doing some of that co-creation stuff. Mm-hmm. And I'm hearing a lot of aligning. And you said, we're having all these meetings now so that we will have less meetings later, which a lot of our listeners don't ever really, I want them to think about that. Like, if you invest this time correctly now, getting alignment, it actually helps you go faster later.
Yes.
Tell us today, what are some of the fruit you're seeing from that co-creation, this rallying around for the one, and really mobilizing the people of Calvary? What's some of the fruit you're seeing? And then maybe where are still some misalignment things you're sensing?
Yeah, I feel that I believe we're seeing fruit in terms of we have a clear picture of what our 3 focuses are. Everyone knows what we're trying to do. When we have meetings, we call them staff huddles. And during a staff huddle, we basically would come to our central location, which is our largest location for Lauderdale. And every week we pray and we worship together for like the first 10, 15 minutes. And every staff huddle, we're planting the seeds of, this is where we're going. This is where we're going. And at circles, we're constantly talking about it. And that's trickling out to our teams. But I would say we still have a lot of work to do in terms of everybody understanding, how does this work for me personally? I think it works when we say, hey, as a campus, we're doing it. But I think there's a opportunity. And I said this in one of our, we have a key leadership team meeting where a lot of our directors are leading their teams. And I pulled up our strategic plan or vision plan. And I say, here are the 3 things. But if you don't personalize it, it won't leave this room and go to your team. So we're trying to close the gap of, I've just given you our play sheet. But if I'm the quarterback for my team, the quarterback doesn't know the play sheet. The receivers won't know where to go. The running back won't know where to go. The offensive line won't know whether to block for a run or pass. So we're in the season now. The work is, how do we personalize it? And how do we still let go of some of our sacred cows? Because some folks are still saying, well, we're not doing all of this yet. Can I still do all of these things? And so you still have a lot of this old, I would say, scope creep coming up. So we still have to suppress some of that. So we're a work in progress, I would say. We're further than where we were, but we still have room to grow.
Oh, man. That's so, you know what? It's refreshing. You are hitting on something I think all church leaders need to remember. You are never going to arrive when it comes to alignment. There's always going to be scope creep. And the one that I hear you highlighting, if I'm just kind of recapping for our listeners, is you got to own it personally. Like, if you're not running the play personally, it really does become just an institutional programmatic thing. And so that's number one. I love that you are applying, we use the term guided self-discovery, but co-creation,
Mm.
where you're inviting people in to create kind of this personal ownership of the basics. Love that you guys are doing that. And then just the forthrightness to understand we're never going to arrive there. So really good, Duane. Thanks for this time, man. Thank you so much for joining
Absolutely.
me. And listeners, we just thank you for listening to this week of the Intentional Churches podcast. As you know, we've talked about it a few times. This season, we're really focusing on radical alignment back to the personal ownership of the Great Commission. Duane highlighted that greatly for us today, how he's doing that in a very complex environment. And you can download a free ebook called Radical Alignment. It's about a 15-minute read. It's got some practical tips and tools that you can actually do with your team to start, continue moving on this journey to alignment. Just go to intentionalchurches.com/podcast, and you can download that ebook there if you're newer to this journey. Thanks again, listeners, and we'll see you next week.